likely to greet them if they ever make it back to some of their cities and towns and villages. There's nothing amazing about the fact that home is so special to us. We're all patriots, but I think our patriotism would be of a very feeble kind if we couldn't withstand occasional confrontations with some confronting facts, challenging facts about the kind of society Australia is becoming. Now, there are plenty of things to celebrate about Australia. I think, in fact, chief among the things to celebrate is the fact that we have done, by world standards, such a brilliant job of creating a harmonious society out of such extraordinary cultural and ethnic diversity. We shouldn't really be surprised by that. It's in our DNA. When the first fleet arrived just over here in 1788, there were about 60 nationalities represented in the people on board those ships. And of course they arrived on a continent where about 350 nations were coexisting. So we're good at that. We've always been good at it. We're so good at it that if there are outbreaks of racial prejudice or tension of some kind, it makes the news. It's worth reporting because it's so unusual for a country that, generally speaking, has been an example to the world of social cohesion in ethnic diversity. But let's not get carried away with how terrific we are. I want to bring to your attention what I think are the two most significant facts we need to confront about contemporary Australia. Understanding these facts, the connection between them and what lies behind them, I think will help to improve our understanding of many of the social issues that Australia is now confronting. Fact number one, and by the way, these are not unique to Australia, but let's just talk about Australia. Fact number one, we are experiencing a mental health crisis, an epidemic of mental health. In round figures last year, according to Beyond Blue, 2 million Australians were suffering from a diagnosable anxiety disorder. Another 2 million were suffering depression. Another million in round figures were suffering some other form of mental illness. And in fact, the health professionals now say 40% of us will experience an episode of mental illness in the course of our lives. And of course, we're hearing alarming figures about the proportion of young Australians who are experiencing mental health difficulties even before they reach adulthood. So there's fact number one. Something's amiss when such a huge number of Australians are experiencing those disorders, especially anxiety and depression. Fact number two, despite what I was saying about our extraordinary effort at achieving social harmony with such ethnic diversity, we are nevertheless becoming a more socially fragmented society than we have ever been. And that problem of social fragmentation has absolutely nothing to do with ethnicity, has absolutely nothing to do with immigration or any of the other things that people are often beating drums about, suggesting that these are the sources of our social difficulties and loss of social cohesion. Let me suggest what sort of changes are taking place in Australian society that actually do contribute to a loss of social cohesion. And that together, I think, justify the statement that we are becoming more socially fragmented than we've ever been. Top of my list is the phenomenon of the shrinking household. It's not an absolutely recent phenomenon. Our households have been shrinking for 100 years. In the last 100 years, while the Australian population has increased 5-fold, the number of households has increased 10-fold. So we've been creating households at twice the rate we've been growing the population, which simply means our households are getting smaller. The average Australian household now is 2.5 people. The Australian Bureau of Statistics, ABS, tell us we're heading for an average of about 2.2. Every fourth household now contains just one person, and the single person household is the fastest growing household type in Australia, destined, the ABS predicts, within the next 10 or 15 years to be one household in three. Now that isn't the kind of society that any of us grew up in. A society where every third or fourth house contains just one person. And that, of course, doesn't necessarily mean loss of social cohesion or threat to social inclusion. There are many people who live alone who absolutely love living alone, who regard their solo householder status as a symbol of freedom and independence, who can socialise with their friends, visit their families when it's absolutely necessary, and interact with colleagues at work, all that, go home, shut the door, punch the air, alone at last. Now I can watch daytime television and no one's going to criticise me, or I can eat baked beans straight out of the can. Yeah, there's a lot of people who love living alone. And there's a lot of people who don't love living alone. People who've been pitchforked into solo householder status because of bereavement or relationship breakdown or some other change in their circumstances that causes them involuntarily to be living alone. And those people are one of the high risk groups for feelings of social exclusion and social isolation. Now, living alone, as I say, doesn't automatically mean that you feel lonely, but it heightens the risk that you'll feel lonely. And we know that in Australia and in comparable Western societies, loneliness is now emerging as a major social issue. And loneliness, of course, as a phenomenon, is a symptom of loss of social cohesion. The UK last year appointed a Minister for Loneliness, which I think was absolutely the wrong strategy. I don't think it's a government issue at all. And by the way, the Minister for Loneliness has since resigned. But that's possibly the least of Britain's problems at the moment. But Swinburne University and the Australian Psychological Society last year published some research on loneliness in Australia, in which they reported that 25% of Australians feel lonely. This is amazing stuff. 25% of Australians feel lonely most of the time. That is to say, more than half of every week. A quarter of us are reporting feelings of loneliness. Swinburne recently repeated that study just in Victoria and just on young people, 18 to 25-year-olds, and their finding was that 1 in 3 of 18 to 25-year-olds report feeling lonely most of the time, even though, of course, this is the most connected generation in history. Not surprising that we're talking about heavy users of social media as the most connected and most lonely generation in our history. So there's one factor that contributes to, or at the very least, increases the risk of social isolation and even feelings of social exclusion. There are many other factors. I'll quickly run through them because we want to talk about the implications of all this. But the rate of relationship breakdown has to go on this list. When I was a kid, about 7 or 8% of Australian marriages ended in divorce. Today, between 35 and 40% of contemporary marriages are expected to end in divorce. Unrecognisably different attitudes towards marriage as an institution. In fact, increasingly it's not regarded as an institution. It's regarded as a particular kind of relationship, and if it isn't working, well, we're out of here. I've been there. I'm part of the growing large minority of Australians who've been through that. But obviously that's socially disruptive. It means if there's just a couple living together and they split, a two-person household becomes two single-person households. If there are kids involved, it's more complicated than that, and of course there often are kids involved. So we're a society which today has roughly 1 million dependent children living with just one of their natural parents. And here's a thing to imagine. Once a week or once a fortnight, half of those kids, 500,000 kids, are involved in a mass migration from the home of the custodial parent to the home of the non-custodial parent for an access visit. Hugely disruptive in the early stages. Most families who go through this adapt to it and figure out how to manage it in the best interests of all, especially the kids. But in the early stages, the typical story is one of pain and anguish and feelings of dislocation and disruption. And while I'm mentioning kids, I think we have to add to our list of contributors, contributors to the threat to social cohesion. We have to add the low birth rate. Our birth rate now stands at 1.7 babies per woman. The replacement rate is 2.1 babies per woman. You may remember a few years ago when Peter Costello introduced the baby bonus to try and get the birth rate up. He succeeded, particularly in lower socioeconomic strata of our society. He succeeded in a less than spectacular way. The birth rate staggered up from 1.7 to 1.8 babies per woman. There was talk of a mini baby boom. It was extraordinarily mini. We know what a baby boom looks like. We had one in the 15 years after the end of World War II, when the birth rate hit 3.6 babies per woman. That's a boom. 1.8 was half that, and it's since slumped back to 1.7. It'll probably fall lower than that. Britain has a lower birth rate than ours. Countries in Western Europe, Italy, Spain in particular, have low birth rates around about 1.2, 1.3 babies per woman. So we still have some way to fall. Now, why am I mentioning this? Well, any of you who are parents will know that if you move into a new neighbourhood, it's almost always the kids who get to know each other first. The kids act like a kind of social lubricant. They form little networks. They meet on the school bus or in the soccer team or in the playground, and gradually the parents get to know each other through the kids. So neighbourhood networks are often stimulated by kids. So when we become the kind of society we are now, which is, relative to total population, we're producing the smallest generation of children Australia has ever produced, that social lubricant is in shorter supply. There just aren't as many kids relative to total population to do that important job of creating neighbourhood connections. We compensate, of course. The graph that shows how the birth rate has fallen needs to be set beside the graph that shows how pet ownership has increased dramatically, particularly dog ownership, and we know that they're child substitutes because of the names that they're given, don't we? You can't find a Fido or a Spot anymore. They've all got... In fact, I spoke about this recently and someone came up to me afterwards thinking that I would like to know that his dog is called Hugh. So there's no end to the madness. I know a Harry, I know a Fiona, dogs. I know an Ian, a very odd name for a dog. Well, you take your dog to the dog walking park and the dogs frolic and the owners maybe chat a bit. So it's a kind of substitute, but maybe not quite as effective as with children. Very quickly, a few other things I'd add to this list. We're an increasingly mobile society in two senses. On average, we're moving house, just like the Americans, once every 6 years. If you've lived in the same house for the last 40 years, imagine how often some other people have been moving to get the national average up to once every 6 years. And of course, we're more mobile in the sense that we have virtually universal car ownership. Most of us live in drive-in, drive-out suburbs, where we come and go by car. You wave at your neighbour's car. You assume your neighbour is driving, but it's not the same as stopping on the footpath and having a little chat. And another contributing factor, I think, is our increasing busyness. Have you noticed how busyness has become a kind of social virtue in Australia? It's very hard to find someone who will admit to not being busy. I hope there are a few people here who would cheerfully say they're not busy, but most people talk about how they run off their feet. Even people who retire very quickly learn that they're expected to say, I'm so busy, I don't know how I ever found time to go to work. Well, it's even changed the way we greet each other. Have you noticed that? We're a strange breed, we Australians, almost uniquely in the world. When we greet each other, we ask the question and supply the answer. It used to be, how are you going, all right? Now it's, how are you going, busy? As though, are you busy or are you dead? The switch can only be on or off. Well, busyness, and it's true, I mean, people with, of course, if you're underemployed, busyness is not your problem, though you may have to pretend to be busy. But if you've got a full-time job, and people in many other circumstances, it is the case that people in full-time work are now working longer hours than ever. The promised benefits, the golden age of leisure that the information technology revolution was going to usher in is still a long way off. And people are saying, of course, you never really leave work because you've got your smartphone or your tablet or your laptop and you're constantly in touch, catching up with work that you didn't have time to do during the day. Well, busyness is the great enemy of social cohesion. Busyness is the great barrier, particularly between us and our neighbours. It insulates us. We're so busy, we don't even know what's going on. You hear these tragic stories of people in Sydney, just a few kilometres from where we are now, a couple of years ago, where a couple died in their home in the suburb of Mosman. No one knew they died, and eventually someone raised the alarm and the police went there and they were both dead. It's a tragic story, I won't go into the details of how it came to be both of them. But the police were astonished and they said to the neighbours, you know, what didn't you notice that these people were, oh, we're so busy, they said. In other words, they were saying not, we're too busy to help. They were saying we're too busy even to notice when help is required. What a threat to social cohesion our busyness has become. And of course the IT revolution itself poses a threat to social cohesion, the very opposite of what it appears to be doing. It's promising to make us the most connected generation in history, and that's true in the sense that we are exchanging data with each other at a greater rate than was ever dreamed possible in the past. But the revolution that connects us so relentlessly also makes it easier than ever for us to stay apart from each other and to settle for texts and Instagram posts and Facebook messages and so on, at the expense of the richness of eye contact, face-to-face interaction, all the subtlety, all the nuance of interpersonal communication. Well, let me stop my little list there. I'm sure you can think of other items you might add to a list like that, but just even with the ones I've mentioned, put that all together and imagine what it's doing to us, whether it's the shrinking households or the devotion to IT or the busyness or whatever. Cumulatively, pretty obviously, those factors are reshaping our society and putting enormous pressure on the stability and the cohesiveness of local neighbourhoods and communities. And contributing, I think we can safely say, those sort of factors are contributing to the rise of a rampant individualism, feeding what we've now come to think of as the me culture, where it's all about me, my happiness, my entitlements, etc., not us and the well-being of the communities that we belong to. Now, I said at the beginning of all this that I was talking about two facts: the mental health crisis, the epidemic of anxiety and depression in particular, and the increasing risk of social fragmentation. Of course, those are not two facts, are they? Those are just two sides of the same coin, because we're human. It is the characteristic of, the central characteristic of the human species, that we are social beings who need each other. We are, not just in the cosmic sense, but in the real here and now flesh and blood sense, we are all one. We can't exist. We are appalling in isolation. We can't exist without the groups, the families, the herds, the tribes, the communities that sustain us and support us and nurture us and even give us a sense of who we are. Much of our sense of personal identity, of course, comes from our interactions with the people we live amongst. Now, I'm not suggesting that the only cause of our epidemic of anxiety and depression is increasing social fragmentation. I recognise there are lots of triggers in individual cases for anxiety in particular: rent stress, job insecurity, loss of faith, loss of time spent in contact with the natural world, relationship breakdown, addiction to IT devices and other forms of addiction. We know all of these things are well documented as triggers of anxiety. And there are genetic factors, of course. Some people are just born anxious and need a lifetime of therapeutic support in order to deal with their inborn anxiety. But that's not most of us. When you're looking at a societal problem on this scale, it seems to me you have to look for a societal explanation, and that's where I think social fragmentation and the attendant risk of loss of social cohesion is the villain of the piece. We are by nature communitarians. When we're cut off from our herds, we suffer health consequences, anxiety and depression notably. Why in our criminal justice system is solitary confinement the worst punishment we can think of to inflict on a prisoner? The answer is, it is the worst punishment you can inflict on a member of a social species. To isolate them is to punish them. The effects of social isolation, according to a recent American paper on the subject, are not confined to the sort of mental difficulties that we so glibly identify as anxiety and depression, but are also associated with increased inflammation, increased hypertension, increased rate of cognitive decline, negative effect on the immune system, higher incidence of smoking, less likelihood of consulting the healthcare system, greater risk of addiction to IT devices and so on. It's no of becoming a more socially fragmented society because of all these changes to the way we're living. What are we going to do about that? And if we recognise that the consequences of increased social isolation and the threats to social cohesion are health consequences, most often discussed mental health consequences, then perhaps it's time also for us to reflect on the fact that the mental health crisis is ours. You don't have to be personally gripped by anxiety or depression in order to finally accept that because we are all one, because this is our society, because we ourselves have shrunk our households, we've walked away from our marriages, we've embraced our IT devices, we've allowed ourselves to become busy, we've done all these things. Now, on such a large scale, we have these health consequences. Isn't it time for us to say, sure, there are health professionals who'll be there to support and help people out of these difficulties, but isn't it our problem as well? The tragedy, I think, is that we have not, perhaps until very recently, come to understand that our own health, especially our mental health, is inseparable from the health of the communities and neighbourhoods that we belong to. Now, there's no single simple answer to what we might do in order to address the problems that I've been identifying. But there is, I think, a single word that illuminates our understanding of the nature of the problem and that might lead us to work out our own strategies for how we're going to address the problem. And that's that good old-fashioned word, compassion. I think one of the consequences of becoming a more individualistic and materialistic society is that we are a society now suffering a compassion deficit. Our social attitudes, whether towards Indigenous people or asylum seekers or refugees or other groups, even the unemployed, our social attitudes seem to be hardening, and that, it seems to me, is an absolute, almost inevitable consequence of the loss of our feeling of being all one. Now, when I talk about compassion, I need to make it clear that I'm not talking about an emotional state. I'm not talking about some kind of bleeding heart phenomenon where we go around loving each other in the emotional sense. When I talk about compassion, I'm talking about a cool, rational, mental discipline. I'm talking about what I think is the only truly rational response to an understanding of what it means to be human, which is, because we need each other and can't survive without each other, because the future of the species depends not just on reproduction, but on our ability to create, maintain, sustain life-giving communities that support us, surely the only rational response to that insight is to say, well, we better treat each other well. We better treat each other kindly. We better treat each other respectfully, tolerantly, inclusively. That had better be our way of being in the world. That's what I mean when I talk about compassion, and it seems to me the challenge, the test of whether we've got the compassion discipline mastered is that we are able to act kindly and respectfully towards people we don't actually like much. It's got nothing to do with affection, that we can act kindly and respectfully towards people we disagree with most profoundly about politics or religion or any other aspect of life. That's what compassion is all about. Compassion, of course, is the great antidote to anxiety. Anxiety leads to a very self-absorbed state. People who are in the grip of anxiety become obsessed about how they're feeling, and that can blind them to what's going on around them. When they exercise compassion and start attending to the needs of people in their midst, the anxiety may not vanish, but it will melt. And many people who've suffered anxiety do say, when they're suddenly called upon to help someone in need, the woman next door has broken her hip and I've got to mow her lawn or do her washing or do her shopping or something, I'm not anxious. I'm focusing on responding to that need. Compassion is the great antidote to anxiety. Compassion is also, of course, like the high-octane fuel that drives the machinery of social capital, the thing that makes a society's function in a sustainable and healthy way. If you believe in peace rather than war, then you're a believer in the power of compassion. If you believe in harmony rather than discord, you're a believer in the power of compassion. If you believe in mediation and cooperation rather than conflict and confrontation, then you're a believer in the power of compassion. There's a town in the county of Somerset in the UK called Frome. If you decide you want to Google this later, it's spelled F-R-O-M-E. F-R-O-M-E, it's pronounced Frome. About 5 years ago, a GP in the town of Frome, we should honour her name is Dr. Helen Kingston. She came to the conclusion that's embedded in much of what I've been saying this morning. Looking at many of her, particularly elderly patients who were suffering from anxiety, she noticed that they were also socially isolated. And so she began doing something which has come to be known as social prescribing. She would write on a prescription pad, not here's the drug to get from the pharmacy, but join a choir, or ask the neighbours in for a drink, or go to church, or join a book club. In other words, she would give as a prescription to these patients the idea they should take some initiative to get connected with people around them. Now that's a great initiative, of course. An even better initiative is for people who are not socially isolated to know that in our street, in our apartment block, someone is at least at risk of social isolation, and not for us to wait for their doctor to socially prescribe that they come and talk to us, but that we recognise the threat and talk to them. Dr. Kingston's initiative, by the way, grew into a major project in Frome, which came to be known as the Compassionate Frome Project. She and other health professionals, psychologists and civic leaders got together and developed a public education campaign in Frome, which resulted in a 3-year study of the effects of this, resulted in an improvement in most health indicators across the town of Frome. And in fact, the most surprising of the improvements was a dramatic reduction in the rate of emergency admissions to hospital. In Frome, over this 3-year period, emergency admissions went down 17%. Across the county of Somerset, they went up by 29%. And a palliative care physician in Frome said, "We've never before had an intervention that resulted in such a dramatic shift." So what did they do? What did the Compassionate Frome Project consist of, apart from doctors socially prescribing? Well, it was so brilliant and clever, the sort of creative, the sort of thing you would never think of on your own. You'd need me to tell you what they did. It was a public education campaign that said things like, get to know your neighbours. Don't ever pass someone in the street without acknowledging them, smiling and saying hello. Join. Get involved in a men's shed or a book club or a community choir or a community garden or something. Be prepared to give people the gift of listening. In other words, the Compassionate Frome Project was all about be a neighbour. It worked dramatically there, and of course it works dramatically in many communities all around Australia. In fact, the Compassionate Town concept formally is coming to, I think, 12 locations in Australia at the moment, including the northern beaches of Sydney. But do we need to wait for the Compassionate Town project to arrive in our street, or is it time to recognise that the health of our nation, the health of our society, can best be assessed by the health of our local neighbourhoods? The neighbourhood, the oft neglected neighbourhood, is the test bed of our commitment to compassion. And I say that because, of course, it's very easy to be nice to your friends, very easy to be nice to your colleagues because you have a lot of interest in common. It's easy for most of us to be nice to our families. But when you move into a neighbourhood, unless you're one of those eccentric people who interviewed everyone in the street before you bought or rented a house or an apartment to make sure this was a compatible group, most of us find where we want to live, move in, and then we look around and discover we have neighbours, and they're all weird. And they look at us and decide we're weird too, because we're all weird. And we have to figure out how to get along with people we didn't choose to live amongst, who will probably never become friends, some may, who may have very different ethnicity, different religion, different politics, different methods of child raising, different tastes in music, different opinions about how loudly the music should be played, etc. All that, but they're neighbours. And unless we understand that one of our primary responsibilities as citizens is to be neighbours, then the whole idea of social cohesion, social inclusion, compassion is all just theory. We can come to conferences and talk about how we can make Australia more compassionate. It's all hollow unless we've done something in the street where we live. If you dream of a more compassionate society, if you dream of a society where we are kinder, where we are more respectful towards each other, then it seems to me, step one, start living where you live as if we are that kind of society, and pretty soon that's the kind of society we will at least begin to become. Thank you.
So, but I may take the first question if that's okay. You know, something that you raised about the health of the individual being affected by social fragmentation reminded me of this analogy about the human body and how, you know, the health of the human body is like the health of a society, and that every cell has a role to play in that health. And it made me think about how the body is one and how every cell is one with that body. And your idea and your contribution about the thought that, you know, we are all one. And that to me is a really important conviction that we must have. I'm wondering, how can we strengthen that conviction so that it motivates us to do all those things, like overcome anxiety or apprehension to get to know our neighbours, to help others, to identify those who are potentially isolated or anxious, you know, who just want a friend, a neighbour who cares.
Yes, yes, and not even necessarily a friend, just someone who'll listen, someone who'll smile, someone who'll offer to help, bring the washing in if it rains. Simple things. We all know how to be neighbours when there's a crisis. I mean, it's interesting that we talk about the initiatives we might take to improve the health of a local neighbourhood. We don't need any advice when there's a crisis. If there's a bushfire or a flood or a disaster of some kind, we all rush out and act like neighbours because we know what's required. It would be, I think, a tragedy if we reached the stage where it needed a crisis or a catastrophe to galvanise us. But you're right, it does take some courage for people who have not got to know their neighbours. I mean, I heard a man on the radio just in the last couple of months saying he lives in a terrace house in the inner west of Sydney, and he was saying every night he goes to bed, puts his head on a pillow up against a wall, which is the common wall with the house next door in the terrace, and he knows that on the other side of that wall someone else is putting their head on their pillow, and he doesn't know who they are. He's never spoken to them. And that is becoming almost, of course not universal, but almost a cliche of life in our biggest cities, Sydney, Melbourne, increasingly Brisbane, but even some of our smaller cities, where people say we don't know our neighbours. Now, I think it's important to observe that no one ever says we don't know our neighbours in a spirit of pride and achievement, as though finally we don't know our neighbours, we got there. They always say it wistfully, as though this is weird, you know, we live next to these people, we don't know who they are. So we're a funny mob, aren't we? I mean, we're quite inhibited about this. It needs someone to break the ice. It needs someone to say, well, if we don't know our neighbours, there's only one way to solve that problem. I'll go and knock on the door and say, "G'day, I'm Hugh, I live next door," or 2 doors down. I'm not going to bother you, but if you need anything, here I am. Do you want to come and have a drink on Friday or something? Of course, it can be overdone. I mean, I heard someone very recently who lived in a cul-de-sac in Melbourne saying that someone in the cul-de-sac had decided that they all needed to get to know each other, and they instituted pizza night every Friday. So all the neighbours got together and shared pizzas every Friday night until the point was reached by this woman who was telling me the story, where she would sneak into her house and put the blinds down, turn the lights off and pretend not to be there, because she didn't want to have pizza every Friday night with people who were not her friends but just her neighbours. So you can't overdo it, but there's a happy medium. And so it does require people like everyone in this room who are thinking about these issues to say, well, it doesn't need that much courage to talk to someone in my street that I've never talked to, or to start saying, I mean, I'm going on too long about this, but the whole concept that we've been teaching our kids about stranger danger is totally opposed to the idea of social cohesion. Of course we have to teach our kids to recognise when there is danger, but to tell them that a stranger is by definition dangerous, and therefore don't make eye contact with strangers, don't say good day to people you don't know, is training them to be social isolates.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a roaming mic, so I'll let Martha choose.
Oh, you don't make me the enemy.
Okay. Thank you for what you've been saying. I just want to share a little bit and then ask you a question. My mother taught me to say, to do a wonderful thing, to be a neighbour. We've moved about 19 times since I've been married, and so she taught me that if you move into a neighbourhood, you're the new person, you bake something and you take it around to all of your neighbours and you introduce yourself as the new person. But if you notice that somebody has moved in, you're now stationary, so somebody else has moved in, you also bake and you go around and you introduce yourself. And my daughter said to me, but we're always the one doing the baking and why is it always us? I said, because it breaks the ice. And we have consequently had neighbours all over the world, like get to know us. But I mean, what is it that, how can we get that sort of idea into the community as a norm? That it's not, you don't even have to bake, you can just have something on a little, because if you come with a plate, they are, if it's a real plate, they have to bring it back. And it just it creates that connection. But I'm just wondering, how do we get that sort of idea, which got given to me as a child, into the whole society?
That's another reason for banning plastic plates, isn't it? Exactly. Probably 2 generations ago, that sort of behaviour was regarded as pretty normal. Now, we have to be careful of the seductive pull of nostalgia about all this. Well, it wasn't universally the case, but it was more the case. But there were other features of society back then that made that easier, and from which we've moved on, like the idea that women stayed at home and looked after the children because there were lots of children, and that the street had a kind of life during the day and on weekends, which it now doesn't. Well, we're not going to turn that clock back. We're a different kind of society, but it does need people like your mother and now you to set the example of saying, well, I think this is the way to think of it is, if I move into a new place, by moving into a place where I'm surrounded by these other people, I have taken on the obligation to be their neighbour. I can't escape that. I live in this apartment, there are other people in this apartment block, so it's like an unwritten contract. Okay, I've got to be a neighbour here, moved into the street, I've got to be a neighbour. How will I demonstrate that? I'll need to take some initiative. I'll need to say, I'm new, g'day, maybe bake a cake, or maybe just pick some lemons off the tree, or some little gesture that symbolises the fact that we've made contact. I mean, you can't wave a magic wand. It's up to us to set the example individually so the ripples gradually go out. Yes. Right. And there's a very patient person in the front.
Hugh, it's a privilege to hear you speak today. I consider you one of our elders and a great mentor to us in the society. I worked as a medical practitioner for over 40 years, writing many scripts for kindness actions and so on. One of the things I found with patients under huge challenge, particularly life-threatening illness, I have a defining question for them. I ask them, do you have a faith? And I wonder what you found in your research, that defines the people who might have the inner tools and capacity to deal with isolation, mental health, if they have a faith or if they don't.
Yeah, well, the research evidence on this is fairly conclusive. Martin Seligman, who's regarded as a sort of father of positive psychology and often misinterpreted as a merchant of happiness, which he isn't, but his research has concluded, and others similarly, that in order to be a fully functioning person, we have to have faith in something greater than ourselves. It's the principle of Alcoholics Anonymous, that you won't be able to fix your problems on your own. You'll need to have faith in something greater than yourself.
Struggling very hard to maintain our identities, whether we come from another country or whether we're here in this country here, and also to sustain that, particularly against the power of what I would call, white superiority, white ways of doing things, where we're always being measured against that, rather than being able to develop our own ways, being our own culture, our own cultural identity, our own cultural heritage.
Yeah, thanks for that. And this goes right back to what Ida was saying about the cells of the body, really. They're all different, they're unique in their own way, but they contribute to a whole. Look, obviously our sense of ethnic or religious or cultural or whatever identity we want to focus on, the sense of that identity is very important to our sense of who we are, but it's not the whole story. The more we focus on that aspect of our identity, the more likely we are to get caught up in conflict and confrontation with people who claim a different identity. Now, I'm not denying the importance of cultural, racial, ethnic, other forms of identity. Obviously, those things are crucial to our sense of who we are, but I think we also have to look more deeply at who we are and say, beneath my identity as a Torres Strait Islander or an Australian of Scottish heritage or a Syrian refugee, beneath that, I'm a human. And when you examine what it means to be human, you find that the thing we most have in common with each other is our capacity for compassion. And that has got nothing to do with identity, except in the largest sense of human identity. So I think we've got to move to the point where we say, sure, we've all got particular dimensions of identity, and let's think about that word. Identity is about how we identify differences. Identity is all about difference. Humanity is all about commonness. So we need both to have a complete sense of who we are, but if we become focused too much on the identity, then we'll be focused always on difference, and that means we'll be contributing to confrontation and conflict, whereas if we go a little deeper and focus on our common humanity, a lot of that stuff evaporates. Yes?
Hi, my name is Vijay, and I'm a member of Tamil Women's Development Group in Sydney. I was absolutely blown away by your talk because last week Sydney Morning Herald said Australia is losing $500 billion a day because of mental illness. And I never gave it a thought about the social cohesion and mental illness. Together, you actually opened my eyes to it, and also made me realize the solution is really very simple.
Yes.
And it doesn't really involve big money or anything like that.
Absolutely.
Just some willpower and what you call human purpose to do something about it. That's all you need.
A little bit of courage.
Yes, a little bit of courage. The way we are going, I'm actually afraid for the young children in this country. When they grow up, what sort of a world they are going to face. want to make a difference, and you have actually given me a lot of thoughts. When we go for these sort of talks, people say, oh, that was a very good talk, and then nothing happens. I don't want this talk to end like that, because this is an absolutely important message that you have given, and all of us must take it and do something. What can we do? I mean, I feel that the government nationally should have a promotion, saying Neighborhood Day, and ask people to have street parties or whatever to get the neighbors to promote that. And I do work very closely with Cumberland and Parramatta Council on a voluntary basis, and I'm actually going to have a talk with the community capacity building about it to do something.
Yes.
So I think all of us, can you give us some pointers how to implement what you have said, which is such an easy one, doesn't cost any money or a lot of money.
No, it doesn't cost any money. And look, by the way, there is a neighbourhood day.
Yeah.
It's called Neighbour Day.
Yeah.
It was started by a man, I've forgotten his name. Do you know the person? No, it's a man in Melbourne. It does exist. Relationships Australia have taken it over, and they're now starting to promote it nationally. I think it's in February. I'm an ambassador for it, so I should know the date. But that happens. So those sort of things are designed. But it's interesting, Anthea said she doesn't think it exists anymore. It has a very low profile at the moment and needs to be beefed up. However, don't wait for Neighbour Day. I think the thing we all need to take away is there anyone... I mean, there's another initiative also out of Melbourne, the suburb of Williamstown in Melbourne, where a group of students are conducting a project called 5 Up, 5 Down. Get to know the neighbours 5 doors this way and 5 doors that way in order to create more overlaps within the community. Now that sort of initiative is terrific. I'm not hopeful that we're going to get leadership on this in politics, and I don't actually care. It'd be nice if these sort of things were acknowledged in our political discourse, but it really is up to us to say, righto, tomorrow I know there's someone on the end of the street who I see but I've never spoken to. I'm going to speak to them.
Thank you very much.
We really have to go. Yeah.
I very, very reluctantly have to call this session to a close because Hugh does need to leave.
No, he doesn't. He does one.
He's very busy. But very busy doing very meaningful things such as this today. So friends, yes, I would like us to all please thank Hugh once again, and I'm very sorry for